The narrow gate, why only a few ever find true inner freedom. Enter through the narrow gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. But small is the gate and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it. These words from Matthew 7:13-14 have echoed through history for nearly 2,000 years, and yet they feel more relevant today than perhaps ever before. We live in an age of infinite choices, endless distractions, and constant noise. Social media algorithms feed us what we want to hear. Consumer culture promises happiness through acquisition. Self-help gurus offer quick fixes and easy transformations. But Jesus spoke of something entirely different: a narrow gate, a difficult path, one that only a few would find. Why? What makes this path so challenging? And more importantly, what does it mean for those of us trying to live meaningful lives in the 21st century? Today, we're going to explore these ancient teachings, not just from Jesus, but from the Essenes, the mystical Jewish community that preserved the Dead Sea Scrolls, and connect them to the psychological insights of Carl Jung and practical wisdom for our daily lives. This isn't about religion versus psychology, or ancient versus modern. This is about timeless truths that have guided seekers across centuries. Truths about why real transformation is rare and what it actually takes to find genuine inner freedom. To understand Jesus' teaching about the narrow gate, we need to understand the world he was speaking into. First-century Palestine was a place of spiritual ferment. Multiple Jewish sects offered different paths to God. The Pharisees with their detailed law observance, the Sadducees with their temple politics, the Zealots with their violent resistance. But there was another group, the Essenes. These were ascetic communities that withdrew from mainstream society to pursue spiritual purity. They believed the world had become so corrupt that only by separating from it could one find God. The Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered beginning in 1947, give us unprecedented insight into their teachings. The Community Rule, one of their central texts, speaks of two ways, or two spirits, the way of light and the way of darkness. Every human being, they taught, had to choose between these paths. Sound familiar? This is remarkably similar to Jesus' teaching about the narrow and wide gates. The Essenes wrote, "He has created man to govern the world and has appointed for him two spirits in which to walk until the time of his visitation, the spirits of truth and falsehood." They understood something profound. The majority of people, even religious people, would choose the easier path. The Community Rule describes how one must separate from all the men of falsehood who walk in the way of wickedness. Now, Jesus wasn't necessarily an Essene. Scholars debate this, but he was certainly influenced by this spiritual environment. When he spoke of the narrow gate, he was drawing on a well-established understanding that spiritual awakening requires swimming against the current of mass culture. The Essenes practiced rigorous self-discipline. They shared possessions, studied scripture intensively, and maintained strict ritual purity. But more than external practices, they emphasized inner transformation. The Damascus document speaks of the new covenant, where God would write his law on human hearts. This wasn't about following more rules, it was about fundamental inner change. The kind of change that makes you different from the crowd. The kind that leads you through the narrow gate. What's remarkable is that this teaching, about the few finding truth while the many remain lost, appears across wisdom traditions throughout history. The Greek philosophers spoke of it. Heraclitus said, The way up and down are one and the same, meaning the path to wisdom requires embracing paradox and difficulty. The Stoics, particularly Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius, taught that freedom comes through discipline, not indulgence. Marcus Aurelius wrote in his Meditations, "Very little is needed to make a happy life. It is all within yourself, in your way of thinking." Buddhist teachings speak of the Noble Eightfold Path, not the easy Eightfold Path or the popular Eightfold Path. The Buddha explicitly taught that most people would not achieve enlightenment because they weren't willing to do the difficult inner work. The Desert Fathers and Mothers, Christian monks and nuns who retreated to the Egyptian desert in the 3rd and 4th centuries, echoed these themes. They left the comforts of civilization to wrestle with their inner demons. Abba Moses taught, "Go, sit in your cell, and your cell will teach you everything." Islamic Sufis spoke of fana, the death of the ego self that precedes spiritual awakening. This requires, in the words of Rumi, dying before you die, letting go of who you think you are to discover who you really are. Hindu and yogic traditions describe the path to moksha, liberation, as requiring tremendous discipline and surrender. The Bhagavad Gita speaks of the rare soul who seeks the eternal over the temporary. Indigenous wisdom keepers across cultures have always taught about the vision quest, the difficult journey one must take alone to discover their true purpose. The pattern is universal. Wisdom traditions across time and culture understand that real transformation is rare because it requires giving up what most people desperately cling to: comfort, approval, and the illusion of control. In the 20th century, Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung gave us psychological language for what these ancient traditions knew intuitively. Jung called it the process of individuation, becoming who you truly are rather than who society expects you to be. Jung observed that most people live what he called the provisional life, always waiting for their real life to begin. They conform to social expectations, play roles, and avoid the difficult work of self-discovery. This is the psychological equivalent of the wide gate. It's easier, more acceptable, but ultimately leads to what Jung called spiritual poverty. The narrow gate, in Jungian terms, requires what he called the encounter with the shadow. The shadow represents all the parts of ourselves we'd rather not acknowledge: our anger, our selfishness, our fears, our primitive impulses. Most people project their shadow onto others rather than owning it themselves. Jung wrote, "Everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is." The narrow path requires the courage to look at these darker aspects of ourselves honestly. This isn't self-hatred, it's self-honesty. Jung understood that you cannot integrate what you refuse to acknowledge. The wide gate allows us to maintain our illusions about ourselves. The narrow gate demands that we see clearly. Jung also spoke of what he called the transcendent function, the psychological process by which we hold the tension between opposites rather than choosing one side or the other. This is incredibly difficult. It's much easier to be all good or all bad, all spiritual or all worldly, all victim or all hero. The narrow path requires what Jung called holding the tension of opposites. This is why so few find it. It requires tremendous psychological maturity. Jung observed that true individuation often requires what he called the dark night of the soul, periods of profound uncertainty, loneliness, and spiritual crisis. These aren't obstacles to growth, they are growth. But most people will do anything to avoid these experiences. He wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. But this privilege comes with a price, the willingness to be different, to be misunderstood, to walk alone when necessary. Jung also understood that individuation isn't selfish, it's actually deeply service-oriented. He wrote, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. But when you do this work, you become a source of healing for others. You stop projecting your unconscious material onto the world." This connects directly to Jesus' teaching. The narrow gate isn't just about personal salvation. It's about becoming the kind of person who can actually serve others authentically, rather than from ego or compulsion. So why is this path so narrow? Why do only a few find it? Let's be honest about what it actually requires. First, it requires giving up the addiction to external validation. Most of our choices are unconsciously motivated by what others will think. We choose careers, relationships, lifestyles, even spiritual practices based on how they'll be perceived. The narrow path requires learning to validate yourself from within. This is terrifying for most people. Jung observed that we'd rather be wrong with the crowd than right alone. Social media has amplified this exponentially. We're now addicted to constant feedback, likes, shares, approval from strangers. Second, the narrow path requires embracing uncertainty. The wide path offers the illusion of security. Follow these rules, buy these things, believe these ideas, and you'll be safe. The narrow path acknowledges that uncertainty is the only certainty. This requires tremendous faith, not in dogma, but in the process of life itself. Third, it requires taking full responsibility for your life. No more blaming parents, circumstances, society, or bad luck. The Essenes called this walking in the spirit of truth, seeing clearly what is, without the comfort of victim stories or blame. This doesn't mean circumstances don't matter. They absolutely do. It means taking responsibility for how you respond to circumstances. As Viktor Frankl discovered in the concentration camps, the last human freedom is the ability to choose your attitude in any given set of circumstances. Fourth, the narrow path requires what the mystics called dying to self, not literal death, but the death of the ego's constant demands. The ego wants to be right, to be important, to be comfortable, to be special. Spiritual growth often requires letting these desires die. Jung called this voluntary suffering, choosing the difficulty that leads to growth rather than avoiding all discomfort. Most people will do anything to avoid suffering, even when that avoidance creates more suffering in the long run. Fifth, the narrow path requires solitude, not isolation, that's different, but regular time alone, in silence, away from the constant noise of other people's opinions and agendas. The Essenes understood this. The Desert Fathers knew it. Jesus himself regularly withdrew to solitary places. But solitude terrifies most people. We've become addicted to distraction, to constant stimulation. Being alone with our thoughts feels unbearable. So we fill every moment with noise, music, podcasts, social media, busyness. The narrow path requires the courage to sit in silence and face what emerges. So how does this ancient wisdom translate into practical daily choices in the 21st century? Let me give you some concrete examples of what choosing the narrow gate actually looks like. In relationships, the wide gate is people-pleasing, avoiding difficult conversations, staying in relationships that drain you because it's comfortable or expected. The narrow gate is having honest conversations, setting healthy boundaries, and sometimes choosing solitude over toxic company. I've seen people stay in marriages for decades, not out of love, but out of fear. Fear of being alone, fear of judgment, fear of starting over. The narrow gate sometimes means having the courage to leave. Sometimes it means having the courage to stay and do the deep work of healing and growth. In Korea, the wide gate is choosing work based solely on money, status, or family expectations, even when it crushes your soul. The narrow gate is discovering your authentic gifts and finding ways to serve through them, even if it means less security or prestige. This doesn't mean being irresponsible or naive about practical needs. It means integrating soul and survival, not sacrificing one for the other. In consumption, the wide gate is endless shopping, eating, consuming as a way to fill inner emptiness. The narrow gate is learning to be satisfied with enough, finding joy in simplicity, distinguishing between wants and needs. Jung observed that most neurosis comes from substituting material acquisition for psychological development. We try to buy our way to happiness instead of growing our way there. In information consumption, the wide gate is endless scrolling, consuming whatever the algorithm feeds you, living in echo chambers that confirm your existing beliefs. The narrow gate is choosing your information diet deliberately, seeking out perspectives that challenge you, regularly disconnecting from the noise. In spiritual life, the wide gate is spiritual materialism, collecting practices, teachers, and experiences like trophies, going to workshops and retreats and reading books, but never doing the difficult daily work of transformation. The narrow gate is committing to simple, regular practices and actually living what you learn. The narrow gate is also learning to discern between spiritual bypassing, using spirituality to avoid dealing with practical realities, and authentic growth. In emotional life, the wide gate is avoiding difficult emotions through addiction, distraction, or blame. The narrow gate is feeling your feelings fully, learning from them, and letting them move through you naturally. This might mean sitting with grief instead of immediately trying to feel better. It might mean acknowledging anger without acting it out destructively. It might mean facing fear instead of running from it. In daily schedule, the wide gate is living reactively, responding to emails, texts, and other people's urgencies all day. The narrow gate is protecting time for what matters most to you, even if others don't understand. This could be as simple as starting your day with silence before checking your phone, or ending it with reflection instead of mindless entertainment. Here's what seems paradoxical to many people. The narrow gate leads to more freedom, not less. Jung understood this paradox. He wrote, "Your vision becomes clear when you look into your heart. Who looks outside dreams. Who looks inside awakens." The wide gate appears to offer unlimited freedom. Do whatever feels good, buy whatever you want, believe whatever is comfortable. But this apparent freedom becomes its own prison. You become enslaved to your impulses, your appetites, your need for approval. The narrow gate requires discipline, discernment, sometimes saying no to immediate gratification. But this constraint creates space for authentic choice. When you're not driven by unconscious compulsions, you're free to choose based on wisdom rather than impulse. The Essenes understood this. Their strict community rules weren't about control, they were about creating conditions for spiritual freedom. Like a riverbank that constrains water but gives it power and direction. Think about it in practical terms. If you discipline yourself to exercise regularly, you have more energy and health to enjoy life. If you discipline your spending, you have financial freedom. If you discipline your attention, you can focus deeply on what matters. The narrow gate is about choosing your constraints wisely, rather than letting unconscious patterns constrain you. This connects to what Jung called conscious suffering versus unconscious suffering. We're all going to suffer, That's part of being human. The question is whether we suffer consciously in service of growth or unconsciously as victims of our own unconscious patterns. The narrow gate is choosing the suffering that leads to freedom rather than the suffering that keeps us trapped. So who are these few who find the narrow gate? In my observation, they share certain characteristics. First, they've usually experienced some form of crisis that shattered their illusions about the wide path. This could be addiction, divorce, career failure, health challenges, or spiritual crisis. Crisis, as difficult as it is, can wake people up to the fact that the conventional path isn't working. Jung called these meaningful crises, disruptions that force us to question our assumptions and find deeper sources of meaning. Second, they develop what I call sacred discontent, a healthy dissatisfaction with superficial answers. They're not content to just get by or fit in. They sense there's something more, and they're willing to seek it even when others think they're being too intense or serious. Third, they cultivate what the contemplatives called beginner's mind, the humility to keep learning, to admit they don't know, to be changed by what they encounter. Pride keeps people on the wide path because it's easier to defend what you already believe than to grow beyond it. Fourth, they develop tolerance for uncertainty and paradox. They can hold questions without immediately needing answers. They can sit with mystery. This is incredibly rare in our culture that demands instant information and clear positions on everything. Fifth, they find community with other seekers, but they don't need group approval to validate their path. They understand the difference between healthy community and codependent belonging. Sixth, they commit to regular practices that keep them connected to deeper reality, whether that's prayer, meditation, journaling, time in nature, or service to others. They understand that transformation requires consistency, not just inspiration. Finally, they learn to distinguish between their ego's agenda and their soul's calling. This takes years of practice and usually requires guidance from others who've walked the path. These aren't perfect people. Perfection is another ego trap. These are people committed to growth, to truth, to becoming more fully themselves. As we conclude, I want to offer you a simple reflection that might serve as a gateway to this deeper path. Look at your life right now. Where are you choosing the wide gate, the path of least resistance, maximum comfort, and broad approval? Where are you living provisionally, waiting for your real life to begin? And where are you being invited, perhaps through circumstances you didn't choose, to step onto the narrow path? Where is life asking you to be more honest, more courageous, more authentic? The invitation to the narrow gate isn't about becoming religious or spiritual in some conventional sense. It's about becoming real. It's about living from the inside out rather than the outside in. Jesus said only a few would find this path, not to discourage us, but to prepare us. The narrow gate requires everything: your comfort, your illusions, your need to be understood by everyone. But it offers something the wide gate can never provide: the deep joy of becoming who you truly are. Jung wrote, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. But on the other side of that terror is a freedom that no external circumstance can touch." The Essenes, the Desert Fathers, the mystics of every tradition, they all discovered that the narrow gate leads not to restriction, but to the most expansive life possible. A life lived in alignment with your deepest nature and highest purpose. The gate is always there. The path is always available. The question is not whether you're worthy of it. You are. The question is whether you want it enough to pay its price. As you leave this video, ask yourself, What would it look like to take one step toward the narrow gate today? Not tomorrow, not when conditions are perfect, but today. The few who find it aren't necessarily the smartest or the most spiritual. They're simply the ones who chose to begin and then chose to continue, one step at a time. The gate is narrow, but it leads to life, real life, the life you came here to live.